Well, hello everyone. Welcome back again to the Day 9 Daily number 15 on November 15th again. It appears I ended up with some sick lag, so we're just going to go ahead and reboot since we're not too far into things. So, yeah, we're watching Pusan vs. Jangbi. Once again, we can just swap right over to the screen. And hopefully we'll be able to speed through this a little bit. Shouldn't end up being too bad. So, I'm going to go ahead and just speed through this opening a little bit, not pause too much. Because I always forget, I always end up forgetting to open the map beforehand. So, whenever I end up doing that, it tanks the bit rate. It just collapses the stream. So, I better not do that in the future. I ended up having to have a little bit of a bumpy start this time, so no big deal. Trying to work on that a little bit. So, for all of you who just saw this, get ready to watch it once again. We can skip ahead just a little bit because we can pretty much recap the points that we were going over last time. Essentially, the theme of this game is to make sure everything flows into something normal. We see this proxy gateway and a bunch of manor pylons by Pusan, and still, he ends up doing something very, very normal as a result of it. A lot of the brilliance of these sorts of cheese openings is not that you can do it. It's not that this pylon can be here and that you can sneak a gateway up there. It's that it gives you some just slight advantage over doing something extremely normal that you can end up exploiting at some later point in time. I mean, look how many probes Pusan has mining. He's clearly getting a little bit better of an economy. We have the manor pylons going on. And while this is all going on... Oh, and look at that, Pusan got a zealot out. That's kind of cool that he managed to sneak that out. I'm not sure if he's going to be able to get that out every single time. I would actually prepare an opening where you can still be in a good position if that one zealot does die. And I think Pusan might actually be in a really good position, even if that zealot does end up dying, just because he ends up with these two manor pylons. He ends up taking Jangbi's gas and gets his own gas a little bit earlier. So one thing I was saying a lot in the early game is the fact that this double bridge allows you to expand without getting reavers. You can tech straight to Templar, which is a little bit easier to control of an army and ends up saving you a little bit of money on your tech tree. On any other map, you'd end up worrying about being contained if you had a double bridge or something like that. But the fact is, on this map, you have that backdoor exit, so everything ends up being okay. I'm just going to thank the person who ended up notifying me. Thanks a whole bunch. Anytime there is lag, if you have some way of contacting me, definitely spam me. I always appreciate when people let me know I'm lagging, because it does suck to talk for 30 minutes, and it turns out that the whole thing's gone to hell, and I was just blah, 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 happily going on about nothing. So at least we only lost 2 minutes of time. Hoorah. So here we go. So here, now we're starting to see how everything's formulating together. We're starting to see what the end effect of this early harassment is. We're starting to see now that Jangbi is kind of tunneled into getting two gateways early. He can't just go one gateway reaver. Doesn't feel too safe, especially because this gas hasn't even started building for Jangbi yet. I mean, Jangbi's correct to make these zealots in the meantime, but in terms of what he's doing next, getting two gateways and getting dragoons reasonably quickly seems like probably the safest option. And then maybe expanding and doing whatever he wants to do next. And we're going to see Pusan take advantage of this by getting his range upgrade a lot earlier. I don't really want to say a lot earlier. Getting his range upgrade slightly earlier. This gives Pusan this timing window where he can put pressure on Jangbi. And perhaps take out this expansion. Because again, if you are tunneled into doing two gateways early on, it's pretty likely you're going to be expanding, especially on destination, because it's so easy to hold off. God, I think I tore something in my shoulder. There's this line of pain in my left shoulder, and every time I drink water, it's just the hardest thing in the world. Even shampooing my hair lately, it's just oh God, I have to shampoo hair one-handed, which is actually really hard. Try shampooing your hair with one hand. It is the most difficult thing in the universe. I'll end up with just half a clean head. Be like Two-Face from Batman, except instead of just looking horrific, it's just that I smell a little bit funny on one side. But anyways, now we're starting to see this Dragoon pressure come out right now. So this is probably what most, like, maybe C+ level players and lower will understand that they're exploiting, is slightly faster Dragoons. But they won't acknowledge the slightly faster Dragoon range. So we see this, we see the Dragoons coming over here, poking out a little bit, and almost all players will do that. Almost all players will use their Dragoons, maybe shoot at these Zealots a little bit, but they won't end up realizing that this range is the whole key. So Pusan's doing the correct thing and pulling back. And notice how almost identically timed their builds are in terms of getting these expansions. And also notice that this is actually really important. We're going to go briefly into Jangbi's main, and we will see that he's not getting Dragoon range yet. And I don't think he could have researched in like the last 30 seconds or something like that. But he's in fact going for a robotics facility, because if you're kind of in the dark if you're in Jangbi's situation, so you also have to fear Dark Templar. So quite naturally, he's going to end up getting that robotics facility fairly early. We see Pusan getting the same, but that's less to do with his fear of Dark Templar and more to do with his ability to pressure his opponent. He's going to be able to get Reavers and actually try to do some sort of early push. And again, it's going to be pretty safe to do that, because we know the sorts of path that that Jangbi's sort of set himself down to. And look at how normal this game looks right now. I mean, if you loaded this up right now, most people would not have expected that Pusan ended up building a gateway like right over there, but he did, and it's like really cool to see how normal this is. I love it when people end up doing something really normal, but they have this like slight edge in what they're doing. So we're seeing Pusan be pretty aggressive with these Dragoons, but he can be because he has range. This is like totally safe to do. If you are trying to do this normally, I mean, don't mislearn what's going on here. Don't think that if you ever have your opponent contained that it's correct to always be trying to aggressively move across the ramp. The reason Pusan can do this is because he has range. Most of the time you just end up sacrificing Dragoons. And the usual sorts of response. See, here's that very early observatory. Jangbi really has to worry about those Dark Templar. There's always a few things that you're going to be thinking about whenever you're in Jangbi's situation. Really, I would probably say it's 3 or 4 possibilities. It would be fast Reavers, either for Reaver drop or Reaver push early on. Fast Dark Templar, early expand, or some sort of super aggressive all-in, which I would... the defense against a super aggressive all-in I would lump into the category of some super aggressive Reaver push early on. So really just those 3 things. Early pushing, including with Reavers. Oh, by the way, look, there's the range right there. Early pushing with Reavers, fast Dark Templar, or early expanding. Those are the 3 things you need to worry about. And because Jangbi can't scout, he ends up being weakest against the early expand. Just because he can't find that out. And this is also really good by Pusan to not just constantly send units across the ramp. He's in fact keeping a few units back just in case something a little bit weird happens, like a scouting probe comes around, or if there's some sort of unusual counterattack. And also to keep a sort of funky count on his Dragoon numbers at the front. Because really he's not worried about being broken at the front so much. He's able to hold his own with just those 5 Dragoons and that 1 Zealot there. Jangbi also very good about getting those gateways up early. And these are very normal numbers that you'll see in Protoss vs. Protoss. Getting about 4 gateways with your expansion while you get these Reavers. Always good to know the numbers of when things end up happening. Now, in Protoss vs. Zerg, you can sometimes do something like have 4 or 5 gateways, some cute unit combination off those, and then end up expanding pretty early. Again, taking your 3rd base. You generally aren't able to do that in Protoss vs. Protoss, so you'll end up completing your tech tree a little bit more. That's why we see these forges coming down. We saw the Citadel being made right here. It's just so difficult to hold expansions. A very aggressive unit combination that will allow you to get an expansion a little bit earlier. We see Anytime actually likes doing this a lot in his games when he skips Reavers. You end up getting about 6 or 7 gateways, and you already have a lot of Dragoons from the early game, and you just flood with Zealots and Archons, push out across your double bridge, and expand again. It's a really, really simple transition to do after you have all those Dragoons, and really, really, really fun and easy, because you get to be really aggressive. You have this super, super fast army. You're not held back by the speed of shuttles or by the speed of High Templar. You just get to jam right out there. And also something we'll end up seeing a lot later on in this game is really good troop movement along the middle. You end up seeing players move their armies back and forth here if you're Jangbi, and back and forth here if you're Pusan. And that's really, really key in this matchup, is make sure you have really good troop movement, that you're not staying too static anywhere, that you're covering as large an area as possible with your army. And here's some more cute tactics that you get to abuse that we see Pusan doing. When you have your opponent contained here, if you can swing up here and maybe poke around this backside to drop in this little crack here, or to just shoot from that side, always want to be looking for those sorts of things to do. And notice how he is incorporating this tactic into his play. He's not making his play revolve around that tactic. And let me just sneak this window up a little bit so you can't see the status bar. That's why it's really, really impressive that Jangbi mined out that back mineral very, very early. This is going to end up not doing so much. And this was perhaps a really big reason why Pusan ended up losing this game. Oh yeah, by the way, I do end up spoiling the results of my game, because we're all about analysis. This isn't so much a channel focused too much on just being like shoutcasting. We all focus on commentary. I try not to spoiler too much, but I do want to spoil right there, because that is something to note. Anytime you're doing these sorts of tactics, if you end up losing this shuttle, I don't want to be all fancy and be like, oh, it's a mystery. Can he end up pulling back? No, he ends up losing, later on. And I do think that this is pretty significant of a result. I mean, he only killed like 1.5 Dragoons. That Dragoon clearly died because of the Reaver, but this one also had some Dragoon backup. And that's one of the things I'm always a little bit leery of. If you're going to be all super fancy with your harassment and do these really cool tactics, make sure that you're just trying to incorporate them. You're not trying to put yourself in a position where if the harassment fails too miserably, you're in like a really dangerous situation. By the way, briefly note that completing a lot of the tech tree, we have a lot of gateways also being added here for Jangbi. This is very similar to what I was saying earlier about where you can just start adding on a bunch of speed zealots and get a few archons out, and then you can end up taking the middle really early and taking an expansion either here or here is fine. Jangbi did, though, end up being able to push out with just Dragoons, and that's because that Reaver died. In Terran vs. Protoss, when Terran ends up killing off the Reaver, they can push really quickly thereafter. And that's exactly what we end up seeing here, is that the Reaver died back there, so Jangbi knows, oh, okay, all that money was spent on the Reaver and it's gone, so surely this army can't be too big out here, so Jangbi was able to push out. So what is Pusan going to do? How's Pusan going to respond as a result of that? We're going to go back to his base and see. Just want to make sure I say it right when we end up seeing it. More gateways being added on. Notice it's 7 gateways. There's that number I was mentioning earlier. 7 gateways with that Zealot High Templar combo. But we see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 gateways for Pusan. He's adding on up to 8. He's going to be adding on a few more gateways and getting a few more Templar because he just lost his Reaver. He needs to make sure he can maintain some sort of presence in the middle of the map, maintain a bunch of aggression, because he just dropped behind in unit count pretty significantly after losing that Reaver, so he wants to make sure he can jump back in there. Oh, also, in Protoss vs. Protoss, make sure you end up getting cannons back there to worry about shuttles in the back of your main. You do need to get cannons pretty early in your main and your expo, just because Storm drops and Dark Templar drops at any point in the game are so devastating. We even see some units being left back here by Jangbi just because he's aware of how serious it is. Also, taking that back expansion is very, very safe. I think the reason that Jangbi's done that right now instead of taking this one is that he moved out really, really early. He moved out probably earlier than he expected because he got to kill off that Reaver, and taking this expansion is very, very safe. Until he ends up with all those speed zealots and those 1 or 2 archons before he starts adding on Templar, I don't think he's going to feel as comfortable taking this expansion. But of course, Pusan, because he's in the super aggressive mode, because he's getting those Templars out early, and he's gotten that Citadel out a little bit earlier, probably going to get speed a little bit earlier too. Pusan's a little bit more comfortable moving out and taking this expansion, because he wants to make sure he can be aggressive and keep control of this area right here. Make sure that Jangbi isn't too comfortable moving up here, so that way he can secure this expansion. I don't really like giving up control of this, just saying, hey, I'm going to keep bouncing back and forth between here, just because this is a little bit awkward if your opponent has a really fast mobile army that they can move up here, and then you'll respond by moving your army here, and then they'll sweep across this bridge really, really quickly, and you'll get caught in this little choke here. It's not that severe, I don't think, but still, I prefer to do what Pusan's doing, where he can move all the way up here. So now we're starting to see Jangbi reinforce with that Zealot High Templar army that he's going to like doing right now. I don't know. I'm not sure if I have an opinion about the fact that Pusan doesn't have these speed zealots yet. These are just normal, regular old slow zealots. I think the reason that Pusan's doing this is because he's feeling in kind of an off position. Even though he's getting this expansion up so early, he doesn't like the fact that he lost this Reaver up here, that he's lost control of this bridge. So he really wants to push forward and do damage with these High Templar as fast as he can. Make sure he gets a really nice benefit from that, and probably hasn't had the opportunity to let speed finish. So he's going to be moving out a little bit earlier. Also note that the way this army ended up positioning itself, the Zealots go up here, and by the way, if these are Speed Zealots, this is exactly what you want. You want the Speed Zealots up here against the Dragoons, and then your Dragoons against your opponent's Archons. That's one of the biggest basics that you want to be focusing on in these big battles in Protoss vs. Protoss that are actually really tricky to end up controlling properly, is to make sure that your Zealots aren't caught against your opponent's Archons, and that your Dragoons are able to kill your opponent's Archons. You want your Zealots against his goons, and your goons against his Archons. Unfortunately, the fact that those were slow Zealots kind of ended up hurting Pusan a little bit much. It does look like there are some units here from Pusan that I really, really like, that in the midst of that huge attack, he was able to move up here and make sure that expansion didn't get taken out. I think we're going to end up looking over there. I don't know if we're going to, but we end up noticing it because we focus on the minimap. We love watching the minimap. Ooh, a minimap. That's why I always extra zoom in with the wonderful Procaster software. That's always wonderful until you end up opening new tabs in Firefox and it crashes. But still, zooming in on that a lot is always good to do. And also, looking at the unit composition of Pusan, we got to take a brief look at it after this battle. It's pretty much those Dragoons were the ones that were left over from the battle. We're going to see them in just a second here. Yeah, these are the ones that were left over from the battle. Only Zealots and High Templar have been pumped out of those gateways. I think that's an important thing to note, because really, if you're looking for some extra money to do stuff with in this matchup, start making Zealots and High Templars. Because one's really cheap on minerals, one's really cheap on gas, and you can end up spending all that rest of that money expanding. You'll end up adding on Dragoons a little bit later when you want a more muscular army. I'm going to put that briefly on hold to note that this is a little bit awkward of a position to be caught in. This is part of the reason why I don't like sacrificing control of this place right here, and that moving back and forth between here can be a little bit obnoxious. So we're going to see Jangbi doing the usual move back and forth across here. Here's all the Zealots and High Templar that have been produced by Pusan. Still no expansion here by Jangbi. That's fine. He's going to end up taking it pretty soon here. But still, he's making that very aggressive composition. Still, yes, very, very low econ composition by Pusan to make sure he can expand. Look, see, at the instant you're trying to move across here, when you're slightly awkwardly positioned, can be really gross. Especially as you look at these units that are having to wander over here. That's really important that you send your army back here and immediately click on the minimap to any units that might be moving up here and directly send them back. Be really mindful of that, because there's like 2 or 3 free Zealots that were in there. Don't want to be doing that. Still very aggressive unit combination being built. More Archons. This is really deadly. So let's think about what's happened right now. So we've seen that there was there was that early Reaver loss by Pusan, so then Pusan responded by adding on all these gateways, expanding, and it started to produce a lot more Zealots and High Templar. That's why we're seeing so many Archons come out from Jangbi. Jangbi knows that Pusan really isn't in the best position to be just kind of focusing on a nice, solid, massive army. He needs to have some sort of aggression in there in order to defend his expansions and that sort of thing. So we know that there's going to be slightly more Zealots coming out than normal for Pusan. So now Jangbi can respond by making slightly more Archons, and he's going to be doing way more damage against Pusan's unit combination. We see all these High Templar and Zealots coming out to sort of combat these mass Dragoon numbers by Jangbi, but the fact that Jangbi is just adding on a few extra Archons is going to be really difficult for Pusan to deal with. So Pusan also wants to look for some way to extend his advantage by getting this gas so much earlier. Jangbi is really focusing on having a mineral army, while Pusan, because of his clever early game, is able to take his gas expansion a little bit earlier. Make sure that if you end up doing that, a lot of players seem not to do this, that they'll by the way, I have a sneeze coming on. I am going to sneeze sometime in the next 5 minutes, and I hate this feeling. When you know it's coming, and it just is not, it's the worst. Okay, so we see this mineral expansion here, and we see this gas expansion here. Surprisingly, a lot of players have the same plan, whether they end up taking the mineral expansion first or the gas expansion first. If you take the gas expansion first, make sure you have some way to exploit that, whether it be to add an extra gateway and start making Templar out of that, or whether it be adding a forge to get more upgrades out of it. Make sure, at the very least, that you have some sort of plan coming out of it. So right now, in Pusan's position, I would expect him to start adding on a lot more gateways, especially after he's built this here. I think now is about the time that he wants to be making some sort of huge, aggressive push against his opponent. Maybe not now, necessarily, but I would like to see a bunch of gateways being added on. Because you end up doing that. You end up doing this alternation. A lot of players tend to think that you want to go down this nice moderate middle path where I'm slowly adding gateways and I'm slowly expanding. You want to do a lot of alternation where you're fiercely trying to expand and having your whole game plan in a short period of time focusing on that, and then suddenly adding on all these gateways to do some really huge aggressive push. And once you are doing that aggressive push, you take another expansion to focus more on doing that sort of thing. So in this case, I feel like Pusan has put a lot of effort in taking 2 expansions reasonably quickly. He got those 8 gateways to have enough units to defend them. He took them, and now I feel like he should be adding on a lot more gateways in order to have some really monstrous push. And here is a push that's going on that actually we should probably focus a little bit on these troop movements, because I said they were going to be important, and we didn't end up focusing too much on them, because there was so much to say. So notice the way that these armies are constantly moving back and forth. Put all your attention right down here on this mini-map. Never is Jangbi's army still. Notice how it's just constantly moving back and forth, same with Pusan. Getting in a good position to flank and surround an army, and to sweep back around here. We have this probe sneaking up by Pusan, just checking up here. And look at this. The instant we see this army move over here, Pusan's going to take this as an opportunity to sweep up here. So this is a really interesting formation to be in on the map. So you can swing units up here if you have a whole army. That's my angry Jabba the Hutt impersonation, because again, Procaster died, and we have to reboot. So once again, we will be breaking into 2 parts. We will end up seeing Jangbi vs. Pusan Part 2. So I'll just go ahead and put the double link up on demand. But for those of you who are watching right now, this is November 15th, Day 9, Daily Number 15, Part 2, Pusan vs. Jangbi. We were spending a little bit of time talking about troop movement, and apparently when I rewinded on YouTube, things died. But hopefully things will end up going smoothly, so let's just go ahead and go back around to the stream. So here we have the map, and I was saying that when you're in Jangbi's position, if you're moving up here, you can end up cutting off an army that's coming up along here, but you need to make sure that you're pretty close right here. It's dangerous if your army's all the way down here, just sort of hanging out, and your opponent moves up here, because then he can get a really solid concave and just demolish your units with storms, dragoons, whatever he wants. So notice the way that Jangbi moves his army. He doesn't move in to attack his enemy, he moves up. So that way he can close down from above using this high ground advantage with some units, and the rest can help make a big concave. That's why Pusan cuts so hard to the right. And then he's going to storm all these back units and hopefully win this battle up here in this corner. I think is pretty important. And this is what you don't want. You don't want his zealots against your dragoons and your zealots against his archons. Not the best place to attack for Pusan, but not the worst. I think that was alright. I mean, the reason I say this is maybe alright is the fact that Pusan is kind of in a icky situation right now as it is. He's a little bit behind, so now I really want to start seeing more gateways being added and more fancy stuff going on. Less fancy stuff going on, and more just like massive amounts of units exploiting this economic advantage, because really this expansion is still behind Pusan, so I really would have liked in this attack for Pusan to do something like add on more gateways. I maybe would like to see some storms, but it's a difficult spot to be in. I mean, storms are just so powerful in general, like storm dropping. But especially on destination, if we just take a look at the map, I mean, really, where are you going to storm? There's really only one position to storm, which is to go up here and then right to the main. Because once your opponent has all these expansions set up, there's no way to really come up here. Well, actually, this is probably the only other spot to hit from a storm drop is to do it here. But you can't really get past to this expansion. You can't really get past to this expansion anymore because units are going to be bouncing back and forth between this region so much. So maybe once Pusan gets a large enough ground army and is comfortable and can manipulate the positioning of this, the storms drops end up being more effective. But note what I just did there. I just said, how can you end up storm dropping effectively? Can you move Jangbi's army to some place that would make the storm dropping okay here? And really, that is the key difference between good harassment and bad harassment. Bad harassment is you just going, I want a storm drop, and just doing it. Good harassment is, how can I make this harassment successful? And doing this sort of troop movement, like for instance, notice that this army moved up here, so Jangbi's going to have to cut back up here, regroup, and then worry about moving to the right. If, for instance, Pusan took this army and then moved around to the backside, then harassment's going to be opened up at that top side. Really nice aggression here by Pusan. Notice he made a lot more dragoons in the midst of the attack up here because he had a little bit more comfortable of an economy. He didn't have to go just dragoons in High Templar. He didn't have to go just zealots in High Templar, which are very cheap units. He ended up going dragoons, which is a little bit more of an expensive unit, a little bit more multi-purpose. But Jangbi is doing a very, very smart thing. I haven't really seen more gateways being added on for Jangbi. Instead, he is sticking with about the same amount of gateways, building cannons, being very defensive, and taking this expansion a lot earlier. I like the way that Jangbi's end up playing this out. He pretty much has just held back for most of the time. And look at this nice positioning by Jangbi. I mean, even with all these dragoons here from Pusan, there's just enough zealots and archons that it ends up shoving this army back across. And Jangbi is not in a good position to be aggressive. Look at this. Pusan, I don't want to use the word barely lost, but didn't suffer a crushing defeat. He just suffered a defeat so that he couldn't move up here. And look, I mean, with the Archon and the Dragoons here, Jangbi really can't risk moving back across. But of course, Jangbi doesn't want to move back across. Jangbi is just comfortably expanding here, and really hasn't crossed this line of the map. Clearly, he's just sort of letting his opponent be aggressive, and hoping to slowly build up enough of an economy, slowly build up Archon count, Templar count, upgrade count, and end up winning with one big giganto push later. Whereas Pusan is trying to chip his opponent down, get all these little advantages by being very, very, very aggressive. Like this, these sorts of cute things, like, oh, I'm going to sneak over here with 12 Zealots. Ugh. Good to do, but at this point, starting to feel as though this might be a little bit desperate. This might be Pusan going, oh, crap, he took that expansion that early? Uh-oh, I got to kill that off. So even though he is going to kill it off, this is always something to note. Whenever you do these sorts of tactics, you see a lot of this in Protoss vs. Zerg. These suicide zealots killing stuff off. A little bit less in this matchup, but still here. You kill the Nexus off, but look, Jangbi's immediately re-expanding. Look at that. Expanding, like, while the zealots are still there dying, he's expanding again. That is really significant to note, that you have bought yourself, like, 2 minutes, 3 minutes of time by killing off that expansion. You haven't really done a huge, devastating blow to your opponent. And it's important, again, that you take advantage of that little timing window. Part of me feels like this harassment may have been a little bit more effective if it was coupled with this attack up at the left. Obviously, it's a little bit harder to do that because this attack happened, and then you don't want to wait 2 minutes and then send zealots up there. If we rewind, actually, we see that the zealot... Yeah, if we see this battle right here, right as this battle ended, now we have the zealots moving up here to the top left. That's definitely the smart play to do, to move these zealots here. But then we have this shuttle, if we slide forward a little bit. Now we have the shuttle coming out for harassment. We gotta make sure that we have some sort of way to make this harassment effective. We can't just suddenly go for harassment. Oh, this is also cool. Check this out. Look at this army composition by Jangbi. We're going to see it in a little bit. Sorry I keep rewinding, but there's a lot of nice, juicy, meaty things to talk about right here. Mostly Zealot, Archon, High Templar. Remember that's the low econ army that frees you up money to do things like upgrade, to expand, to build defenses. It's a really aggressive unit combination because it's so fast, but it's also cheap. Significant to note, because this is probably a lot of the reason why Jangbi is able to expand right now. Now is maybe when he'd be adding on Dragoons again, because he's gotten this expansion up. He's feeling a little bit more comfortable with his defense, so he can start adding the more muscular unit into his army. I use that word to describe Dragoons a lot, because they're not particularly mobile. You'll note that their AI is super bad, but they're a very good unit because they have range. They deal a good amount of damage. I mean, range is actually pretty significant here. And I'll end up coming back to this harassment in just a second. But yeah, there are always key periods where you end up adding on Dragoons or not Dragoons. You end up adding on this muscular unit or something that can be more aggressive or more helpful for defense and this sort of thing. You see, look at how that harassment ended up working. He moved up, maybe stormed a worker or two, and then had to immediately pull back, and he lost a Templar. That is not particularly effective harassment. That's the sort of danger that you want to watch out for, especially, because that shuttle could have easily been picked off. So I really want to see more Dragoons being added onto Jangbi's army, just so, not only so you can see the idea of alternating between low econ stuff like Zealots. Yeah, see, look, there's some more Dragoons that were added on in there. Yeah, I want to make sure that point comes across clearly, that you can add Dragoons on later to sort of bolster the overall strength of your army, because you don't want to have it too skewed towards Zealots and Archons, or else you'll end up losing to someone who does have more Dragoons in their army who can maneuver a little bit better. Also, it's fun because it allows me to be right. It allows me to look like a clairvoyant, when really it's just the fact that I've watched tens of thousands of games of StarCraft, because I'm an antisocial nerd. But it's always good to have a reward at the end of that tunnel. So we see all these Dragoons were suddenly added on by Jangbi, and now he's starting to get what we call like a Doom army, like a Death Ball. Oh yeah, see, look at this. This is just not going to go so well. But look, see, he's doing this stuff with the Zealots. He's going up here, clearly going to die, while this harassment happens on the right side. You don't need to be doing 5 or 6 things at once, just as long as you have 2 things going on at once. The harassment can be very helpful. You're doing harassment, and you're moving Zealots up here. Notice how far these units were to the left, and now they're all having to run to the right. Oh, yeah! Bazillion Templar kills. Yeah, go Pusan. See, that was a nice little harassment that went on there, all thanks to the fact that that troop movement was a little bit skewed over. So, going back to what we were saying earlier, that Jangbi's starting to develop what we call a death army, right? He's going to... He built a lot of zealots and archons, but now that he has this econ up, now that he's feeling much more comfortable with his position, he's going to start adding on dragoons, more archons, Templar, and he's going to start phasing zealots out of his army. As zealots die when he's being very aggressive, he's going to replace them with the more expensive units that make the overall strength of his army higher. Which is a very interesting thing that ends up happening as you approach maxed. You don't want the economically efficient army, which would be lots of zealots and high Templar. You just want the strong army, which is going to be a lot of gas units. And look, so right when Jangbi has balanced his army out with a bunch of dragoons, he started with those zealots and archons. Now he's going to be making a huge push back. And look, it's like impossible for Pusan to do anything. This army is just so strong. There's so many archons there. Archons are an incredibly important unit in this matchup. Definitely always be looking to incorporate them more and more into your game. I mean, this is just absolutely crushing. And the reason this is so scary is because these zealots and archons slowly built up early on when Jangbi was trying to defend these 5 bases, and then these dragoons were added on afterwards as the final tipping point to shove Pusan down. And I want to emphasize, as we saw in part 1 before Procaster crashed, that Pusan ended up losing that Reaver here, which kind of put him on his back foot. It kind of faltered after that. Wasn't really in the best position. Jangbi got the opportunity to move out, get map control, and then Jangbi just is now doing cleanup. He played very safely early on, made sure that he extended that lead slowly over time, kind of forced Pusan to be aggressive, and now is clearly in a very good position. So this is something that I do want to talk a little bit about, this troop movement. You see this a lot, that really good players do this, and a lot of intermediate and down players sort of don't see this, which is, let's say you have this natural here, and you want to attack this expansion. Instead of just going for the expansion, you push forward towards the natural and then back towards the expansion. In this case, Jangbi was able to kill off the expansion, but a lot of times just pushing your opponent across his double bridge and then attacking somewhere else. And this applies on any map. If you want to attack locations A and B, location A or B, push your opponent towards A and then go for B. Don't just straight off go for B, or something like that. And this is more desperation moves by Pusan, just trying to hang in there. And I feel all sad that he ended up busting out of the MSL, but at least we get to see him in the OSL. Go, Pusan. Also, another good time to be adding on more and more zealots into your army is when you have like a clear edge in pushing forward. Like if you have this huge army and you're just slamming your opponent down, and you have a pretty good portion of food opened up, just start only making zealots out of your army, or out of all your gateways, and you'll end up being able to shove your opponent down. See, look at all these zealots streaming down there so fast. And what ends up happening is, if you're flooding with zealots, as I put it, you end up having all your archons and dragoons stay alive, and the zealots are all that keep dying. So you end up pretty much with almost the same unit composition, and you're just continuing to push forward really, really fast. And because zealots build so quickly and are so cheap, you end up in really nice spots. So let's just do a little bit of rewinding action. So, to highlight the key points that I want to emphasize is the fact that Pusan did this insane opening with the double manor pylon, the gas steel, the gateway in main, yet he ended up doing something totally normal in the end. If we zoomed about here, we see that Pusan's contained. He has a little bit of early aggression coming out here with the range. And really right here with this Reaver, I feel like that was the icky part. Don't get too aggressive with your... Oh, we actually zoomed right past it. I like to use this phrase a lot. If you're in a good position to win, you just need a little bit of win. You don't really need to vary win, as I put it. You don't need to kill all your opponent's probes and expand them like 15 million times. Oh, by the way, I've just unmuted the chats. That way we have some questions that we could possibly ask. But really, this was, while you guys are formulating some questions, this is the big kind of kicker in my eyes that probably caused some forces in Pusan's game plan. Or, excuse me, probably forced some changes in Pusan's game plan. Because that seemed a little off to me, especially when I was watching it the first time. To go Reaver right now, and then to suddenly add on 2 more gateways and go a big Zealot Archon army. I mean, really, when Pusan lost control here, we're going to get a chance to go back into Pusan's main in a little bit. Let us check it out. Hopefully they'll end up going back here. Yeah, see, look, there's the 2 gateways being added on. That seemed like very clearly is a little bit of a panic, like that. Oh, God, I lost my Reaver, and he has control here. I really got to do something to maintain the advantage. So yeah, let's take some questions. And for any of you still looking for more Protoss vs. Protoss action, we do have another PvP coming up tomorrow. It's Backho vs. Han, so that should be a good amount of fun to cover the one matchup that I haven't covered yet in the Day 9 Dailies, which is Protoss vs. Protoss. So TTT Special said, what do you think about rushing for Archons and skipping Storms in early start of the mid-game? Totally good. Really good. Anytime actually did this against someone. It was early in the Pro League. It was anytime, I want to say, against Pusan, maybe it was. Anytime was at the north position, and what ends up happening is if you can take your expansion and you can get about 6 gateways, and you can go Zealot Archons and bolster your Dragoon count with that, you can push across and end up being in a really, really great position to control the middle of the map, to take more expansions and that sort of thing. I don't like to use the word rushing Archons. I like to say that you go Archons before you get Storms, because Archons are a very, very strong unit and will allow you to really push forward, assuming you have all those speed Zealots. If you have this mass Dragoon army and you just get an Archon and your opponent is going Dragoon Reaver or something, the Archon's just going to like evaporate like that. But the Archons will do a lot of damage and help you expand, assuming you have that Zealot number to back it up. So, Clockwise asks, in Pusan's position, where he got the gas first, wouldn't it be better to expand and add the 3rd and 4th before Reaver? What do I think about that? So, I'm certain that what Clockwise is referring to is the fact that Pusan got this really nice contain going on early, and so if he has his opponent's double bridge security, he has this early Dragoon range advantage, why not just continue to add gateways, make Dragoons, and just expand a whole bunch? I think the reason is that it's a little bit safer to get the Reaver so early, because you can sneak around the back. So, I mean, if we just go ahead and briefly check over on the map here. Suppose you've contained your opponent here, and your opponent just has these 2 bases. There's really one of 2 things that your opponent can do. I suppose, yeah, I would say 2 things. He can either stay a little bit lower on gateway count and take this expansion here, or he can add on a whole bunch of gateways and try to either break out or swing around here. And the swinging around is the most important part of all this. If your opponent, let's say, didn't have this exit here, if he made a whole bunch of units, yeah, you could totally do that. You could totally contain on this side and end up expanding maybe a 3rd time. I wouldn't say necessarily a 4th time, but a 3rd time seems reasonable. But the fact that you can sneak around makes it a little bit dangerous to take that 3rd expansion so quickly, so you can get the Reaver not only to bolster your expansion and to make sure that you don't die if your opponent sneaks around the other side. I think, though, there's a lot of truth in that question. I think, for instance, Pusan, if he hadn't have lost that Reaver, he could have taken his 3rd and 4th expansion very, very quickly. I think that is the correct logic to think, well, can't we be expanding a lot more? Yes, definitely. And I think the reason we didn't see Pusan expand earlier is because he lost that Reaver so quickly. So I like the way that thought process is going, is how can we take those expansions earlier? I think it's more okay to get the Reaver, because you're already at an advantage. You don't need a huge advantage. You just need an advantage. And again, if you could post questions in yellow, because people are posting in orange, green, and red, and I'm getting a serious overload. So Zubin said, can you explain more when you should reinforce your army with zealots to strengthen your push, or when you should be adding more dragoons and archons for, or adding on more goons and archons or storm? So that is actually one of the most fundamental questions to Protoss versus Protoss, is how to start bending your unit combinations around. I would definitely say experiment. That's always my answer to everything. But there are a few general areas where you're going to end up doing it. One is when you're contained and you need a whole bunch of units to burst out really quickly. You end up adding on a lot of gateways so you can produce a ton of zealots. Zealots are your aggression unit, are your bust out unit. So for instance, if you want to be expanding pretty quickly, let's actually go take another look at this map. If you end up having these two bases and you want to take this third, you start making zealots and archons, bolstering your dragoon number, busting out here, taking this, and then you start adding on other units. That's a pretty basic situation to do it. You generally don't end up getting too many zealots before then, for instance, because you have to deal with so many reavers, and you don't really have speed yet. You don't really have a good army size yet. In a lot of later stages in the game, if you have had some sort of really huge battle with your opponent, and you're at a little bit of an advantage, but maybe not a huge advantage, and you're pretty low on the food count, like maybe you've dropped down to like 110 or something, you can end up adding a ton of zealots into your mix, and even add on gateways while your army's dying, and then end up with a really aggressive push forward. Because something I was mentioning earlier on is that you want to skew your unit composition to gas units when you're maxed. So if you're before then, if you can continue being aggressive and never staying maxed, you can end up pushing slowly back and killing your opponent. A great example of that is Best versus Much on Blue Storm. Is a really incredible example of just flooding with a ton of zealots near the end, like right after some big battles, and ending up just crushing your opponent and doing a really huge push back. But try to think about when you're being aggressive, when you want to make a big attack, when you want to expand. And always, whenever you're watching games, think about zealot numbers in terms of those two. I think would be the best way to answer that. So yeah. Ender asks, why did Pusan choose to expand? Why did Pusan choose to expand to the left where he had sticky troop movement, and set it to the right where he had much more space to move? Let's actually go look at the map. So part of the reason we like this expansion is just because it secures this. If we can end up holding that, we feel very, very comfortable. It's not a huge crisis to hold this expansion. This, I think, very clearly is much easier to hold. But you can end up bouncing back and forth between here to hold this expansion off. I think if you take this expansion, you're going to be really, really aggressive. Because the next... do I agree with what I just said? Let me rephrase that. If you take this, it is important to note that you can be very aggressive up along this side of the map, and then focus on taking this expansion as your fourth base. Because by being aggressive up here, you also defend this expansion. So that's a good way to pound down an already weak opponent, is to expand here and move up here. But another benefit of expanding here is that it really cuts off the possible stormable locations. So if you end up taking this and then taking this, you kind of have this nice line, and really only storms here or around this backside are really dangerous. Whereas if you expand here, there's so much room here to get all the storming done there. So I would say that's one of the bigger factors to take this expansion first. And also, further on that point, I think a lot of the reason that Pusan took that expansion is probably because it was part of his plan in the first place, and after losing that Reaver, he ended up adding on all those gateways. So he has a very mobile army of zealots, so he can move to that side pretty easily. And again, the most important thing to know is if you are doing that, if you are taking this expansion, that when your opponent moves here, that you move up along your expansion and then back down. That's a really key tactic. We saw Jangbi do that. He moved up here and then all the way back down. So, So, I love this question. This is a great question. Someone says, I want to make sure I actually get the name. Yeah, Meeple asks, you say that, let's make sure we're not looking at that. Let's make sure we're watching me read questions. There we go. Meeple says, you say that you only have to win by a little bit, but doesn't that give the other guy a chance to come back? This is like the fundamental theorem of competitive games. In any competitive game, all you need to do is win with a marginal advantage. I actually wrote an essay I was quite fond of called The Marginal Advantage, which is the idea that you just need an infinitesimal little smidge of a lead over your opponent, and all you need to do is focus on holding that lead. So that might be a point I didn't emphasize as much, is that you don't just want to make decisions that force your lead to be small. You want to make sure that your decisions focus on maintaining a lead as opposed to extending a lead. A great example of this is in chess. If you end up with a one-pawn advantage, if you just end up a pawn, you focus on trading pieces away and going towards an endgame where you can exploit a one-pawn advantage. Likewise, in StarCraft, if you can end up with a little slight advantage that ends up giving you an expansion a little bit earlier, you will eventually wear your opponent down. So, let me do some examples relating directly back to this game to make sure that's clear. So, for instance, there's a situation where should we expand? Or should we add on Reavers, which seems a little bit safer? I would opt towards the Reavers because we have a much smaller chance of losing in our already advantageous position. Sorry, I lost my train of thought because I read someone else's question. Let me try to what was I talking about? Oh, yeah. If you end up going Reavers, you have a much stronger chance of maintaining your advantage. Whereas if you end up expanding, and this relates back to your question, Meeple, are we giving our opponent more chances to win if we play with all these safe decisions? What ends up happening is that if we expand, that's actually the opportunity for our opponent to come back in. Not when we do a safe decision, not when we end up with these small edges. Any time we go for a bigger advantage, there's always a risk associated with that. So, for instance, taking more expansions, they're harder to defend. If we don't end up defending them, we lose. Or if we expand more, we spread ourselves out more, we have a higher chance of losing to harassment and these sorts of things. So in all your decisions, make sure you don't end up going for something that's too outrageous. That it's very, very I don't want to keep using the word safe. Here's a good way to put it. When you're at an advantage, imagine your opponent has vision of you. Imagine he can see everything that you're doing. You still should win in this position because you have an advantage. And the fact that he can see what you're doing shouldn't have the greatest impact on that. So make sure that your decisions are in line with that idea of, I have an economic advantage, therefore I will just make a stronger army to prevent him from taking more expansions. I have an economic advantage, there's no reason to expand more to get a very economic advantage. That's why you always see players lose games, because they'll be in a really great position, but then they'll try to sneak an expansion in a weird place on the map, or they'll try to suddenly go battlecruiser or do something funny, so they have a funny game, and that ends up losing the game. I like very, very safe responses. I love that practice with the assumption that your opponent has vision of you, because that's actually how I practice before tournaments. Is I give my opponent vision and let him know exactly what I'm doing and see if I can still do it. Here's a reasonable question. Day 9 this is from QQGGYO. Why don't you do Day 9 TV for poker? Because I'm bad at poker. There we go. We got that question out of the way, because I'm actually awful. When I play poker, I do it at sweatshop labor levels. That's why we focus back on StarCraft. So, I'm going to take this one last question. I like this quite a bit. Rommel says, a bunch of people are arguing about Arbiter feasibility in Protoss vs. Protoss. Do you have any thoughts on this? I do, in fact, have thoughts on this. Let's actually do this and one more question. Arbiters are a strong unit in Protoss vs. Protoss, but the big issue is getting them. That is the fundamental problem with Arbiters in this matchup. trying to think of situations where you can actually end up getting them. You know, I almost always have some reference game on the top of my head, but I can't quite seem to recall a game recently where it actually ended up getting to arbiters. What I would say is that never throw a unit out the window. Never just be like, oh, arbiters, oh, they're a horrible, terrible thing to do. Because clearly there are a lot of nice things that you can do with arbiters. For instance, stasising archons. Archons are the biggest pain in the ass unit if you have, if your opponent has any semblance of good unit composition. The archons are really difficult to get to. But if you could just stasis the archons and just get them out of battle, whoa, awesome. And also, I mean, if you can just, if you can even just like kill off his observers, you suddenly have a cloaked army, and he'll feel like a little bit silly. But the whole getting to that position is a lot harder because anyone who's really good at doing this, good zealot flooding, having good unit composition, like exactly the way that Jangbi did, where he was holding and holding and holding and holding, and then just shoved Pusan down. Protoss is pretty fragile once you get to that mid-late game stage. Anyone who messes up a little bit ends up losing. So what I would say is that in terms of late game decision making, I wouldn't throw arbiters out. I would say that Dark Archons are the next best step. Because if you can go into a battle and you can feed back all those Templar, you're going to be in a really, really nice position, and it's super easy to incorporate into your army. You just make 2 Dark Templar, you don't even need to research anything, really low mana count to actually cast the spell. So I think I would focus on that, and then I'd worry about putting in arbiters later. I'll have to think a little bit more on that. I don't want to throw that out the window or anything like that. It's hard to do. I would definitely put it like that. It's very, very hard to do. So let's just go ahead and take one more question. So Zorch asks, man, that's a hell of a name. Zorch, Z-O-R-T-C-H, Zorch. That sounds like one of those really old school adventure games, like someone trying to do a knockoff of Zork. If any of you are into those old school text adventure games, Zorch. Oh, that's so sweet. So Pusan came out with his rush with a slight advantage, even though Jangbi defended well. Why not always use some sort of rush like this? It's really about trade-offs and risk. You have to have really good control when you're doing exactly what Pusan did. And if you screw up a little bit, you can end up losing. And what theoretically should happen, so let me just, at the highest levels, assuming both players are playing perfectly, what should happen is that Jangbi ends up defending as well as he can, and Pusan is like dead even with Jangbi. The amount of money that Pusan invested into that harassment should be absolutely equal to something. Should be equal to something. I don't remember what the start of that sentence was, so I'll just try it again. The amount of money that Pusan invests in doing that whole harassment should be equal to how much he screwed up Jangbi. Let's actually go ahead and take a brief look at the start of the game. So right here, this is a lot of money to end up building a gateway in your opponent's main. You know you're going to be losing this pylon and this gateway, but look at all these probes that have been taken off the gas. You're spending all this money on 2 pylons that are going to die. You're going to be spending all that money on that gateway that's going to die. So what it means is that you should... It puts the burden all on Pusan. If Pusan can control it really, really well and can out-control Jangbi, well, I guess it puts the burden on both players. It just forces a lot of decision-making, a lot of precision early on. If both players play very, very precisely, then obviously it'll be very, very even. But in this case, because Pusan practiced it so much, it ends up really... giving him that slight edge. The obvious risk to all this is that if your opponent is aware that it is coming, he can just shut it down really fast. I mean, even just look at this screen placement. If there is a probe here, just like a probe here and here, suddenly Pusan just has a pylon just hanging out in the middle of nowhere. Really kind of bad to end up in that spot. So there are obviously all these risks associated with it and all these rewards, and it'll still be balanced if both players are playing absolutely 100% perfectly optimally. But I think the answer as to why you wouldn't always do it is because it demands an entirely separate game plan. Whereas if you just learn to play safe, you're focusing on one game plan that can deal with a whole lot, and that you can end up still coming out ahead the way Jangbi did. I would actually focus on doing the Jangbi-like play, the sort of safe type stuff. And then once you have a good grip on that, then doing this sort of Pusan-style stuff, because you need to be aware of how your opponent's going to respond to what you're doing. And a lot of those choices you end up being aware of because you've made them yourself so many times in a row. So I hope I answered that question well. I actually, I'll actually do one more because I'm not as satisfied. So Do the Evolution says, why is it that the defensive one, the defensive and expansive winner, is always the one that's in your commentaries? I don't really think that's the case. If that is the case, it's pure coincidence, because I actually choose a lot of games I don't watch first. But last question from Scrix. Why didn't Pusan keep making Reavers? He used a lot of resources on the tech that he used once. I think that's a good question to finish up. It's a lot harder to defend your expansions at that stage in the game. That's really all it comes down to, in my opinion. Reavers are really great. They can bolster a whole lot of strength to your army, but really it's too difficult to use Reavers at that stage of the game to defend. Because what ends up happening is that you can get surrounded so easily. Your opponent, who has a much more mobile army, can get in really nice positions. Yeah, I just don't really like going Reavers in that situation. You generally want to have that on like 1 or 2 bases. You don't really see like 4 or 5 bases guy like continuing to add on Reaver. The mobility of getting Zealot and High Templar and that sort of thing is just so important. So yeah, that I think will wrap up the Day 9 Daily number 15. We're going for about an hour and 20 minutes now. So now it's time for me to go get some FUD, because I'm quite hungry. So thanks so much, everyone. Oh yeah, the essay that I wrote, if you just go on Team Liquid and look up The Marginal Advantage, it's going to be right there. So yeah, peace out, everybody. We will see... Day 9 Daily number 16. Whoops, I've been saying 15 so much. Well, hopefully someone listens all the way to the end and just doesn't believe what I say. Never listen to what I say, listen to what I mean. So yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.